I'm Carole Taylor. On this edition of Journal, we try to lift the numbers off of the page and talk about the actual challenges facing families in British Columbia. Why is it that politicians here and in the U.S. often say, oh, inflation's coming down, all will be fine? Well, to start with, it is the growth each year of inflation that is slowing. But each year's numbers are added on top of the previous year's jumps. It is cumulative. That's why economists say the cost of living actually went up approximately 20% in the last 5 years when you add up those 5 years of increases. Wages, for the most part, have not risen at the same pace as inflation, so your paycheck just doesn't go as far as it used to. So what does that mean to an average family? Well, it may mean you buy hamburger rather than steak. Very likely restaurant visits are reduced. And it could mean you have to visit the food bank at the end of the month. It certainly means credit card defaults are up, which they are, 11%. And that's a very expensive way to borrow. Baby formula, up 47%. Shelter, up 29%. Food, up 27%. Throughout this past BC election, people repeatedly said cost of living was their biggest worry, their biggest concern. But were the politicians listening? Did we get a calm, detailed analysis of how anyone intended to bring back fiscal discipline as a driving value? After all, if families have to watch their pennies, why shouldn't government? Someone who has written extensively on this sticker shock is economist David Williams from the Business Council of BC. He will join us for an in-depth look at how serious the situation is in British Columbia, and is there anything we can do about it? Back in a moment. We're joined by David Williams, one of Canada's top economists. And honestly, David, all these numbers that get thrown at us, I hope that you can help us sift through them and figure out what it actually means to people, because we sit back and the politicians say, oh, everything's great, the economy's growing, inflation's down, no problem, right?
That's right.
But that's not what people are feeling.
No. I mean, hubris is one of the world's great renewable resources. I mean, that's what we know. But the economy isn't doing too well, and people can really feel that on the ground.
So how come they say, well, GDP growth's up?
It's income, right? GDP, gross domestic product, that is the total income that households and businesses produce in a year, right? And we care about that on a per person basis, so divide it by the population, because that's the amount of income we have to feed our families, to take to the grocery store, to pay taxes and fund our public services. So in a world where the federal government has been relying on population growth to expand the size of the economy, you really have to look at it in per person terms, right? And that's a better metric for overall prosperity, and that's what people are feeling. And that's why there's this disconnect between the federal government, which in the last few years has been crowing about Canada being one of the fastest growing economies in the OECD. That's true. But where's that coming from? That's coming from population growth. We've had population growth of around 3% a year, but top line GDP growth of only about 1%. And so the economy is actually shrinking at a rate of around 2% over the last couple of years. And in fact, if you look at Canada's performance relative to other countries, over the last 5 years, in terms of per person GDP growth or income per person, Canada's economy has shrunk by about 1%. It's the second worst performing economy out of the 38 high income countries in the OECD. Only Mexico was weaker.
Say that again.
We're the second worst performing economy out of 38 countries over the last 5 years. Only Mexico was weaker. By comparison, the United States income per person is 9% higher. Australia, it's 4% higher. France, I think it's 2 or 3% higher. Even Japan, 2% higher. Greece, 10% increase in per person incomes over the last 5 years. In fact, Canada is back to where it was in 2014. So, as I said in an interview with your colleague Stu McNish last year, this really is a lost decade for Canada. Our economy, adjusted for population, is no larger than it was a decade ago, back in 2014. Since then, the rate of per person government spending is up 9%, but per person household spending is only up 3%. Exports, adjusted for population, has shrunk by 3%. And then if you look at business investment, that's down by about a quarter from where it was in per person terms. And even investment in residential structures has fallen by about 16%. So it is a very, very poor, the Canadian economy is in very, very poor shape. BC's in a slightly different position, and we can talk about that, but overall people are really doing it tough out there.
Well, in BC, of course, during that last election, we kept hearing that we've got the best economy in Canada, which sounds great.
It does. And it's true, right? I mean, we're the best of a bad lot. So over the last 5 years, BC's economy in per person terms expanded by about 0.5%. So that's the best in Canada. That's true. But historically, we've grown by 1.5%. So 3 times that rate. And the only reason we got the growth that we did was because of mega capital projects. So Trans Mountain, Site C, Coastal GasLink and LNG Canada. Together, those projects contributed something like $65 billion to our economy over about a decade. Our economy per year is worth about $330 billion. So that just gives you some sense of scale, 65 versus $330 billion. These are huge once in a generation projects, and they're done. They're all completed. So the big question is, what takes their place? And I think the most likely scenario is that BC starts to look a lot more like the rest of Canada, shrinking, sclerotic growth or stagnant growth. I think the most worrying thing for me about the state of BC's economy is if you look at page 99 of the BC budget, or if you look at page 55 of the first quarterly update, just to be very specific, this is coming from the government's own numbers, the growth rate in per person income or per person GDP in the province is expected to fall by about 2% this year, which is about the same as last year. And in 2028, incomes will be lower than they were in 2022. So the government's own forecasts say that living standards in the province are expected to fall and then go stagnant for the rest of till 2028 at least. So it's a pretty grim outlook. And where you're seeing this is, people are feeling this it's true that, you can look beyond GDP and there are lots of other ways to think about what's important in life. Income is not everything in life, but it sure matters when you go to the grocery store and you try to pay at the till. And people are really finding that. If you look at data from BC food banks, there were 200,000 visits to BC food banks last year. That's up 57% from 2019. And you look at who was having to go to food banks to feed their families. 1/3 of visits involved children under 18. Children are only 17% of the province. So that's pretty staggering. New immigrants, people who've been in the country for less than 10 years, they were involved in about 1/3 of all visits. And renters, people who are trying to pay the rent. We've had the highest rental inflation we've seen since the early 1980s here, nearly a 30% increase in rents since 2019. And we have rent control. So that's just, that 30% number is made up of people who don't move and then just saw rental inflation of around 2%. And then people who did move, who had to pay market rents and saw astronomical increases, giving an average of a 30% overall increase. So people are really struggling to pay the bills.
And so what you're saying is that what people are feeling is correct. Things are tough. They're hard to pay all your bills. And so what does the average family do? As you say, sometimes they have to go to the food bank at the end of the month. Credit card defaults are up.
Yeah.
And that's a real dangerous place to be borrowing money.
That's right. And we've got still about nearly half of all mortgages set to refinance in the next couple of years. People who took out loans at very low interest rates when money was essentially free during the pandemic. Money's not free now. I mean, interest rates have come down a little bit from their peaks, but money's not free now. And you know, those homeowners are going to be facing the music over the next couple of years as well. So there's a lot of challenges. The solution really is to have a more vibrant economy. I mean, you know, a $100 check from ICBC or BC Hydro as a rebate isn't going to cut it. The government doesn't have the money itself. The government is on a pretty dangerous fiscal track. So the answer is a more vibrant economy. So that's when you've got to start saying, well, what is it that pays the bills in BC? What is it that makes for a vibrant private sector economy? Those are the questions we should be asking.
And have you done some quick numbers before we leave mortgages about what it means for the average family, this refinancing?
The interest component of what they're paying is going to go up by about, you know, double or close to double. It's a very, very big increase. And you can see people renting out their properties and moving in with family and making all sorts of adjustments they can to try and hold on to their homes if they can. Another question is about what happens to people who have an investment property that is part of their retirement planning, and whether they can hold on to that property or whether they have to give up because they're in negative cash flow. So those are all questions. I just think it's going to be a very difficult time over the next couple of years as these mortgages come due. Canada is the third most indebted country in the world, and most of that is mortgage debt. When it comes to we're talking about households, most of it is mortgages.
We're going to talk about some of the things government could or should do right after this break. Looking at all of these cost of living issues for the average family, let's turn the camera around and say, okay, government, what policies led to this? What policies might get us out of this?
Well, the solution, as I mentioned, is a vibrant private sector. That's where most people work. That's where most people earn their incomes. That's the lion's share of the economy. The answer isn't, a government rebate and so forth. That's not going to cut it in terms of helping us pay the bills.
So what government policies actually led to it being difficult for businesses to thrive and grow?
It's not been a very conducive environment for businesses to operate in BC or in Canada writ large. When I mentioned earlier that we've got a flat trajectory for growth in per person incomes, that's kind of the plan. If you listen to the federal government or you listen to the BC government, you look at the Clean BC suite of policies. I mean, the plan is to put the handbrake on the economy and slow it down. And we want to have a slower economy so that we hit these emissions reductions targets. I mean, BC has a legislated target to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030 relative to where we were in 2007. Now, that's an absolute target. So, going for 3% population growth, as the federal government has been doing, people consume energy. We all use energy. So that makes it even harder to hit your greenhouse gas reduction emission targets.
So you say an intentional plan to slow the economic growth.
That's right. That's right.
I used to be finance minister. I watched that revenue line. You want that revenue line to be increasing.
That's right. No, the plan is to shrink the economy. It's explicitly in the government's own modelling. It's on the government's website. We took a look at the government's modelling, and it shows that there's this trade-off that's taking place between growing the economy and greenhouse gas emissions. Now, there's not to say we shouldn't be managing emissions. We should, and we have been. We were the first province in North America to introduce a carbon tax, and it was done on a revenue neutral basis. So the idea of carbon pricing is that as the carbon tax goes up, you reduce income taxes and corporate taxes, which discourage a lot of economic activity, leaving overall revenue the same. That's the principle. That's why economists like the idea of carbon prices, because it doesn't make choices about which is the best technology to use. It allows people to make choices and to get there in the least cost way. Unfortunately, under the Clean BC plan, we moved away from revenue neutrality. And the increases in the carbon tax over $30 a tonne, the government now pockets that, and then it may or may not spend that money on industrial subsidies or other projects, or expanding the size of government, as we've seen. None of which was supposed to happen under under the carbon tax. The carbon tax also means that you don't have to do very expensive regulatory interventions to get to your emissions reduction target. But we're doing those anyway. So if you put it all together, the economy is supposed to be smaller. I mean, BC did the analysis and showed that, according to the government's figures, per person incomes in the province will be down by about $4,500 in 2030. If you add it all up, what this is going to cost us, it's going to cost us about half a year of income over a decade for everybody in the province, to give up half a year of your income. So that's the plan. There may be some upsides, in the clean technology space, but let's just get a sense of proportions here. The clean and environmental technology sector is about 3% of BC's economy, about the same as it was back in 2008. So 1% of that is hydro. And then another 0.4% of it is municipal recycling. So you're left with about 1.5% of the economy that you're pinning your hopes to, that's going to grow so fast, which it hasn't been doing, grow so fast and become so big that it's going to make us all better off.
So immediately, if you had been elected premier just in this last election, what moves would you take that would encourage business?
I think we need an environmental policy that's built to last, right? And I mean that both politically and economically, and environmentally. Something that the public can afford. And so I would bring back, if I was premier for a day, I would bring back the revenue neutrality principle of the carbon price.
But moving beyond the environmental side, businesses are not encouraged to invest in technology. Their productivity is going down.
That's right. That's right. I mean, essentially, to become more productive, you need innovation. You need companies to be competing with each other and competing with the rest of the world to be the best, to sell their products, their goods and their services. That's how you become better off. The more you interfere with market prices, the less likely you are to get to a better outcome. And we're doing a lot of monkeying around with that signal that companies are supposed to respond to. We might have a grant that a company is supposed to apply for to some bureaucrats and get it. And that's kind of been the model, right? But really the way to getting ahead in life is actually competing and with the rest of the world and competing against other companies. And that fundamental force for higher living standards has really been dampened in BC and in Canada.
Are you seeing businesses leaving BC or just not investing here?
Not investing. So BC Canada has got some very weak investment numbers. In fact, we're not investing enough to cover depreciation of existing assets. So that's an extraordinary situation. So the amount of, when people go to work each day, they've got technology, they've got capital equipment, offices and so forth. Essentially this is like, let's say you were a realtor, you've got the latest iPhone, what is it, iPhone 16, or is that what we're up to?
Yes, it is 16.
Okay, 16.
I'm at 11.
That's good, okay. So you've got your iPhone 17 and essentially what Canada is doing, what companies are doing is they're saying, well, but you get by with an iPhone 8, right? That's kind of the point that we're at. So, you can't take the pictures as a realtor that you wanted to. They're not as good. You can't do as much on your phone with it. So that's just a really basic example, but we're not investing enough. And part of that is that we're discouraging in so many areas. The provincial sales tax is another one. It's a really inefficient tax. It costs us a lot of economic activity to raise that revenue. And so, we have the highest rate of taxation on new capital investment of any province in Canada. That is not a competitive advantage, it's a competitive disadvantage. So that's one. Clean BC, as I mentioned, it's designed to put a handbrake on the economy so that we can get a handle on our emissions. But that's probably going to be offset by the population growth that we're seeing. So these are all handbrakes on trying to get ahead.
And so you've put the picture out there of all the numbers and the problems Canada's having and BC is having. And going forward, it's really a downhill slope by the sounds of it.
Yeah.
So are you, I want to ask you if you're optimistic or pessimistic?
Well, I can only take the government's forecasts for what they are, which is for no improvement in living standards to 2028 in BC. And Canada would be about the same. I mean, we've been declining, as I mentioned, over the last 5 years. That's what the government forecast. That is the plan. So I don't think I'm being optimistic or pessimistic. I'm just looking at what it is and saying there is no plan to grow the economy, at least on a per person basis. I mean, there's population growth, but that's it. But I think the government can get a handle on its own finances. I mean, everybody is balancing their own budget. Businesses are balancing their budget. You can't spend on everything you want at once. So the government can get a handle on that. That's one thing it can do.
And I think that's probably the note we should leave it on. How about getting their ducks in order? Thank you so much, David.
Thanks, Carole.
We'll be back in just a moment. One must be careful when using statistics. A recent headline said reported crime was down in Vancouver. Well, that's great, except the operative word here is reported. So it doesn't count those thousands of events that we don't bother phoning the police about. Same with politicians who say the economy's growing, true, but that's because of the tremendous growth in immigration. But it's not growing for the average family in Canada. Let me know your thoughts on YouTube. Till next time, I'm Carole Taylor.